Hello, everyone. Steve Seepersod coming to you from Binghamton University. Welcome to our program today, Breaking the Stigma of Addiction. This is part of our Binghamton Learning Network webinar series. So excited to have you with us here for today's program. This is just one of many lifelong learning programs offered by your alumni association. I'm going to put up our website address here on the screen. If you want a little bit of a shortcut to this, you can do binghamton.edu/alumni. But this URL in particular will take you to the Alumni Association website. We have so many ways for you to plug into what's going on here on campus from wherever you are in the world. And we have people watching these webinars from everywhere, which is a great feature of this program. It's so inclusive. So if you want to take advantage of things like future webinars, our alumni travel program, our Tier Talk series, we have a podcast series, many ways for people to volunteer at the university, events, so much. Binghamton.edu/advancement/connect. I'll leave that up for a couple of seconds if you want to jot it down, screenshot it, or type it into a different browser tab, and I'll pull that down in a couple of seconds. So excited to have you with us for today's program. This is really meant to be interactive. So we want it fueled by your questions. And certainly I can think of questions, but it's more fun if we get you involved. So feel free to send those to us anytime. If you are watching on Facebook or on the microsite, either one has a space for you to type in a question in the comment field, and we will get these mixed in during the program. So there's no need at all to wait until the very, very end. We can do this pretty much any time. And of course, we'll set aside some time toward the end of the program, the last 10, 15 minutes or so, about 10 minutes for questions, taking us up until 1 o'clock. And it's not necessarily a hard stop on our end. We can go a little bit over. If the questions are good, if the energy is good, and we're all having fun with it, we can stick around a little bit. And definitely this program is for you. We do this for you, with you, and we want to make sure your questions get answered. So go ahead and send those in, and I'll pull up my email address here. And if you want to send it to me by email, certainly that's a very easy way to do it, or you can do it as a comment. And either one will get the questions to me. And then on to our speaker, Merrit Hartblay, who I'll pull up here on the screen, is a two-time graduate of Binghamton University, got his undergraduate degree in 1976. And he loved us so much, he came on back years and years later and got his master's in social work in 2016. And somebody I've known for about 10 years or so. And so I feel like this webinar is not going to be your average webinar. I feel like it's two old friends kind of doing what we do. And he's an addictions counselor, and he's an author, and he can tell you way more about his background than I can. I feel like I can't do it justice. So, Merrit, welcome. Thank you so much. So awesome to have you with us.
Yeah, Steve, it's great seeing you again. It's I miss Binghamton. Binghamton's been my second home for many, many years. So I'll tell you guys a little bit about myself. Like Steve said, I first graduated from Harper College in 1976 and kind of went on a journey from there. Came back to Binghamton in 2013 to get my master's in social work. I've been sober now 17 years. I've been sober since September 24th, 2008. It's been part of my journey, which got me into the field of addiction and mental health. I was really excited about today's topic because I think one of the biggest issues that we face today as a country is the stigma that's associated with addiction and mental health. I think one of the biggest problems I find, and I've been working now as an addiction counselor and social worker for about, as an addiction counselor for about 15 years and as a social worker and addiction counselor for the past 3 or 4 years. And the thing that I found, which is the biggest problem, is that people out there are so many more people than you think that have a substance abuse or a mental health problem. But the problem is that most people don't ask for help because of the stigma associated with it. It's just that, people are afraid. I can tell you that, the stigma is so huge is that people that may have a mental health issue are afraid to ask for help because they think that people will think there's something wrong with them, which is really a shame because I believe everybody should have a therapist. I think that just the other stigma about therapy is that, therapy is a really good thing. I tell all my patients and people that I work with that everybody should have a therapist because if everybody had a place to go, I don't know, once a week, every couple of weeks, once a month, to talk to somebody about issues in their life, the world would be a much better place. But unfortunately, most people don't do that. And I would tell you right now that as bad as the drug problem is in this country, the mental health problem is even worse. And I don't think that people realize that. I think people just don't want to say anything. They keep it inside. But, here's the thing. And a lot of the patients that I work with over the years, I think everybody listening to this program today may have experienced some kind of trauma in your life, way back when, somewhere in your life, you experienced a trauma. It could have been a little trauma, could have been a big trauma. And what happens is that typically when it happens or you experience it, you don't really talk about it. You kind of just push it away, hoping that over time it will go away. But I can tell you that trauma never goes away. And when you least expect it, years later, it could rear its ugly head. And if you're not ready to deal with it, that's when the addiction piece becomes huge. I found that, most patients that I work with, in fact, right now, I'm working with an NYPD guy who is just now beginning to deal with, ground zero, being on the pile for several weeks. And, he came away from that, tried to push it away, and it didn't go away. And when the feelings started to come up, the only way he could deal with it was by drinking. So his alcohol became a real big problem. But now, because, the alcohol really took him down, he's beginning to deal with it. So a lot of clients that I deal with, whether they're in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s, we trace a lot of the addiction and mental health piece back to when they were younger. So I think that for me, and I talk about this all the time, we have to, as a community, it all begins with a community. We have to help erase the stigma that's attached to addiction and mental health. And I think a lot of it has to do with, the lack of awareness. The more that people know that there's an issue, the more they're willing to talk about it. In fact, a big part of the work that I do is with people that have substance abuse issues. And I can tell you that anybody that has a substance abuse issue also has a mental health issue. They're kind of tied together, but you have to work at them at the same time. If somebody has an alcohol or a drug problem and they also have depression and they come into treatment and we say, well, we'll deal with the drug piece and put the depression on the shelf, that's never going to work because now they're getting sober, but they still have the depression, which brings them into a relapse. So it's a big problem. I can tell you that there's been a movement actually in this country now for the last 15, 20 years where people, I believe that if somebody is sober, if somebody has good long-term sobriety, they have an obligation to talk about it. If anybody listening to this program is familiar with addiction or familiar with 12-step programs like Alcoholics Anonymous, when Alcoholics Anonymous was first established in 1935 by Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob, the goal was to be anonymous, right? Anonymity. People that were coming into recovery didn't want to have anybody know about it. So they kept it as a first name only. And I think that was good for a long, long time because people need to know they had a safe place to go. But I think that in the last 15, 20 years, I think there's been because of the stigma associated, somebody is not going to want to go in and ask for help, go to a treatment center and ask for help if they don't know that it works. So most people just don't do anything. So there's been a movement, like I said, in the last 10, 15 years. There's a really good movie, if you like watching movies. It's called The Anonymous People. Really good film. I would suggest you watch it. And basically the movement was this, that people going to AA meetings or 12-step meetings would say, my name is so-and-so, and I'm an addict or an alcoholic. Now the message is, my name is so-and-so, and I'm a person in long-term recovery. Because the words long-term recovery aren't as stigmatized as addiction. So I think that if more people speak up, and I'm doing that now, I've taken it as a personal mission. When I to kind of backtrack, when I was in grad school, I decided to go back to Binghamton in 2013 to get my master's in social work. So I went back to school at 59. A lot of my friends thought I was crazy, but I love Binghamton. My son went there, my niece and nephew went there. It's been a family thing, and I went back to Binghamton. And as I was in grad school there, I was writing a lot of papers in the library, and one day this message came over me that I had to do more. So I decided to write a book, and I did write a book. It took several years to finish it. It's called Lost Innocence: My Journey from Addiction to Recovery. It's out on Amazon. It took time to write. I decided that I wanted to tell people about my story, that you can overcome addiction. You can rise up from the ashes. So I put out the book because I wanted people to know more about addiction and my story. And I think it helped. I've gotten some great messages over the years that it's helped people, either themselves or family members, be able to come to terms with addiction better. And so, I was in grad school and I was loving it and I was learning a lot. I was an addiction counselor for a long time, but I wanted to learn more about theory. So I decided to go back to get my master's in social work so I could learn more about theory. And it was great. I came back when I was actually, it's a funny story. So I was going to school 2 nights a week. I was working 40 hours a week for the Addiction Center of Broome County, which is an amazing place in Binghamton. If you know anybody struggling, if you're locally in Binghamton, it's a great place to reach out to. And I was doing the school 2 nights a week and did it for 3.5 years. And then I came back to Long Island where my family is to do some more work. But what I found out was that when I came back, to Long Island, the stigma was still there. Actually, I worked for a treatment center in Long Island in a community in Manhasset, Long Island. And what happened was, because the stigma was so great, the town forced us out of the area because they believed that all we were doing was bringing drug addicts into the facility when half that town should have been in recovery. So I took it upon myself at that time that I needed to really spend more time talking about addiction and the stigma. And so I've been on a platform for a long time. I mean, I think that, it's really all about getting people aware. Communities need to be more aware of mental health and substance abuse. For the last 2 years, I've been working with some state senators here in Long Island, trying to bring mental health and substance abuse programming into the schools. I believe that the earlier we can talk to kids about mental health and substance abuse, there's a greater chance that they won't fall into addiction later on in life. Now, I can tell you that, in most patients that I work with, and even myself, you can trace addictive behaviors back long before you actually picked up the drink or the drug. And most patients that I work with will tell you that when we start to do the work, they'll see that it can trace back to their childhood. So I believed that if we could work programs into the schools and help people become more aware, they could do that. So I've started doing that. I've actually put together a couple of curriculums that I'm working with now from K to 6, from K to 12, to talk to students. So after I did the book came out in 2020. It became a #1 new release bestseller, and I was loving that. Very excited to get the message out. I really didn't do the book. I didn't really write the book to make money. I did the book more for awareness. And then I was talking to my publisher, and we were talking about doing more. So I decided to do the podcast. So the podcast came out also about 4 years ago. It's called Recovery Road. You can hear it on all podcast platforms. And the message was to get more people aware of what's going on in this country. I can tell you, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but, the fentanyl crisis was huge. The fentanyl crisis became a major, major issue. Oh God, going back to 2020, 300 kids were dying every day, and it's still hundreds dying every day from fentanyl murder. It became a huge, huge issue. And as I started talking more about it through my podcast, I started getting contacted from parents all across the country that wanted to talk about losing their family members. So one of the people that contacted me was this grandmother who had a daughter, her granddaughter. Her name was Gracie Parker. Gracie was at that time, I think, about 10 years old. When she was 6 months old, she lost her mother to drug addiction, and the father was completely out of the picture. And, Gracie started talking about, when she was in elementary school, all these kids had trauma. They had nobody to talk to about it. And this became a big problem. So Gracie took it upon herself to go out and start talking about mental health. There's a great website. It's called whyuskids.org. I had her on my podcast with her grandmother. We started talking about mental health. And also, Gracie began to realize about the stigma that young kids, and trauma can affect kids at a very young age. When I was in grad school, I did a paper about trauma, and I specialized in trauma and things like, Hurricane Katrina and Sandy and the shootings in Newtown. I mean, these kids were seeing very horrible things, but there was nobody at that time really able to handle it. Even when I was in grad school in Binghamton, I did a lot of work at Binghamton High School. There weren't teachers that were trained in trauma-informed systems of care, which is really important. I think it's made leaps and bounds today, but I think it's important to realize that kids at a very young age can be affected by trauma. And if their stigma exists now, can you imagine that parents might be reluctant to reach out to help for their kids because they feel that it's a sign of weakness? I can tell you now that asking for help is really a sign of strength, that more people need to recognize that it's okay to not be okay. In fact, I just finished my second book. It's being reviewed now by my publisher, and it's all more about mental health. When I got back from Binghamton, I decided to spend about 16 months working strictly in mental health. And I spent a lot of time at psychiatric facilities working with patients who were diagnosed with mental health issues. Also, on top of that, had substance abuse issues. And I just realized that, we have so much more work to do. It really starts with the kids. So I've been working on that project for a long time. I'm trying to get people more aware. I would say to you, listen, anybody watching this podcast, this webcam today, think about the things that are going on in your schools and your communities. So many people are being affected by things every day, but not talking about it. So again, the mission for me was to really talk about the stigma. Now, I can tell you when I was in grad school in Binghamton, I was also working with students because at that time, the counseling center on campus couldn't handle all the students that were looking for help, which was a tough thing. And I was trying to battle that for a long time. And I can tell you that so many students coming into Binghamton were under so much pressure to perform. Gary Truce, who he just retired from the university last year. He was my track coach. I was 4 years. I did a cross country track at Binghamton. He was my track coach. We became very good friends. And after I graduated, he did a course in human behavior, and I came up and I lectured at the class twice a semester. It was basically freshmen, maybe a few sophomores, and I would ask the students, "How many of you are in this school because your parents want you to be here?" And all these hands would go up. And then I would say, "How many people in the school because your parents said if you don't come here, they're not going to pay the tuition?" And all these hands would go up. And I basically said, "Listen, my message is anybody who raised your hand, you should go back to the dorm, pack your bags, and go home. Because if you're in this school for anybody but you, it's not going to work." There's that expectation from parents for their kids to perform. And I can tell you how many students in Binghamton were like taking their friends' ADHD medication like Adderall, crushing it up and snorting it so they could study in the library late at night. And I worked in Wilson Hospital for a year in the ER, and Wilson is a big trauma hospital in Binghamton. I worked there for a year. How many students were coming in with heart palpitations and all kinds of issues because Adderall presents the same way as cocaine. So it became a real problem. And I think that, these students really needed help. So I reached out, actually. I started working with students on campus, trying to help them with all the pressures of being a student. In fact, and I'm talking about this because it really starts at a young age, and I'm asking people that are listening to this webinar that, to ask yourself, are you struggling? Are you happy every day? My goal for my patients is that, each day you should be happy. But if you're not, if you're struggling, you need to ask for help. I just think that it's an issue that's not being addressed enough. Working in this field for a long time now, the government keeps cutting back on mental health facilities, on treatment facilities, on monies available. It's becoming harder and harder for people to find help. So I think that, because it's become such a huge problem because of the stigma, it's been my mission, and like you to kind of think about if you have no people that are struggling, to reach out to them, because if we don't break the stigma, it's going to continue to exist. So I mentioned that movie earlier, The Anonymous People. So like I said, there was a mission about, I guess it's about 10, 15 years now in a country to help people break the stigma. And I believe that you're seeing it now. I think you're seeing it in Hollywood. People like Ben Affleck, talk about being sober now. Early on, the issue was that there was a problem that if somebody in the public eye said they were in recovery and then they relapsed, people wouldn't think that it worked. But now you're finding people in the public eye are coming out and talking about recovery, which is really, really important. I think that if more people do that, it's going to help. It'll help break the cycle. I think more campuses now have mental health facilities. More people are talking about it. I think that, as a society, if society had its choice, everybody would be comfortably numb, which is a huge problem for me, because I think that if you watch TV these days and all the ads and, take this pill, take that pill, do this, do that. Now, I don't want to get into a long discussion about marijuana, but I think that the country made a huge, huge mistake when they legalized marijuana. I've worked with patients over the years. I do a lot of work with veterans and first responders who've used medical marijuana to work with their PTSD. But beyond that, it's become a huge problem. And now you find more and more people are using cannabis or taking pills, which they think is going to make them better. But there's no pills or drugs out there that are going to take depression away, take anxiety away. You need to be able to sit down and talk to a therapist about that. It's really funny. I'll tell you a side story. Maybe you're familiar. There's a medication called Rexulti. It's advertised all the time on TV. The goal is that you have a sad face, and if you take this pill, you'll now have a happy face. It will, and it says, take this pill in addition to your other depression medications. Well, it's such a misnomer because there's no pill that's going to take away depression. So I got really upset watching this for for months, seeing this commercial, and I got really upset. So what I did was I went on my computer one night and I Googled and I tracked down the company that manufactured Exulti in Japan. And I sent a scathing email to the CEO saying he should be ashamed of letting people know, making people think that if you take this pill, things, your depression, anxiety is going to go away. It's not going to go away. It's going to be there, and it's only going to get worse because, now what happens is people take the pills and then become addicted to them. It's just that I think that it's like the big elephant in the room. Nobody wants to talk about the stigma. Years and years ago, my sister lives out east, and she asked me if I would come and start a community program to bring awareness about mental health and substance abuse. So I went out and I started doing this program. It was like every couple of weeks, I'd come out and talk about addiction and mental health and ask families to come. And so I could talk to them about how the families can talk about mental health and addiction. And in this town, which was like about 6,000 families, if I could get maybe 35 or 40 people at an evening event, that was a lot. And the reason was that people didn't want, if people were seen walking into this community center for this presentation, then the message was they must have a problem. And the town didn't want that to happen because it would drive down the real estate pricing. But the sad thing was that I went to talk to the principal at the local high school, and I said, you have kids dying every day from heroin overdoses. And she was like, no, they're not. That's not the case. The police bring through the dogs all the time to sniff out the lockers. And I said, you are so wrong. And I got really upset about it. I ran the program for about a year. And at the last week, I was like, I think the last week I had like maybe 4 people show up, a couple of parents and their kids. And I was almost in tears because I said, I should have like 400 people in here talking about mental health and substance abuse issues. Instead, the next day on that Saturday, maybe there's 2,000 people lining up at the funeral home for the 16-year-old kid who died of a drug overdose. And I would have parents always tell me, not my kid, not my kid. Well, until it was their kid. And then it was too late. So I really think that we have, an obligation to really talk about substance abuse and mental health. Here's the thing about substance abuse. The other part of this stigma is that people still don't want to understand that addiction is a disease. Back in the 50s, the American Medical Association diagnosed addiction as a disease. People still think that it's about self-will. It's not about self-will. It's a chronic illness, just like, diabetes, just like lupus, just like RA. When I was working in the hospital in Binghamton, if somebody were to come in diabetic shock, okay, you would stabilize them, you give them some food, give them some drink, get them better, and then you could send them home. If an addict came through the doors, they tried to kick them back out as fast as possible, which is really, really a shame. And that goes to the heart of the matter, that addiction is still looked as this ugly thing about some guy sitting under a bridge with a trench coat and a bottle of alcohol in his pocket. Well, you know what? That's not the case. I've been doing addiction work now for 15 years, and I've worked with doctors, nurses, police officers, firemen, runs the gamut. There's no picture of addiction. In fact, I was working with a mom once, and she said to me, her son was a huge heroin addict, and we were trying to we got him into inpatient, working with him. And the mother's like, why can't he just stop? And I said, it's not about stopping. That's not the issue. And she couldn't understand. I was trying to come up with a way to try to explain. So I said, okay, Mom, let me ask you a question. How did your self-will work the last time you had diarrhea? She started laughing. It didn't work, did it? Because it's not about self-will. Addiction is a disease. And I think that the sooner we recognize that, that people will start to wake up to the fact that somebody who has an addiction to drugs should be treated the same way as somebody who has cancer or somebody who has lupus or RA. In fact, I would tell you to get that movie, The Anonymous People, because a lot of the conversations are about, if the gay people had never spoken up about AIDS way back when, you never would have had all the research and all the money put into AIDS. Elizabeth Taylor with AMFAR and Princess Diana working with AIDS patients. If women with breast cancer had never spoken up, you never would have had the Susan B. Komen Foundation and all the money going into breast cancer awareness. So my thing now is that people in recovery need to speak up. I mean, my goal is that someday there would be an American Addiction Society that would recognize addiction, and that people that had a drug problem would not feel ashamed or guilty to be able to ask for help. Because that's the biggest problem that we face as a nation right now, is that people, because of the stigma, will not ask for help. And it's huge. And I've seen it in children. I've seen it, in kids now. Think about this, the mental health piece, the mental health. You must know, think about how many kids have committed suicide because of bullying on social media. And social media has become a real weapon. I think the biggest challenge that we had as addiction specialists was when COVID hit, because now COVID hit and forced people to be at home. And I can tell you that a lot of things happened during COVID. Domestic violence really rose up high. A lot of people who didn't think they had a problem were now faced to work at home. So, maybe I'll have a glass of wine in the afternoon, and maybe I'll have a glass of wine in the evening. And then it became a couple of drinks, a couple of glasses of wine, and became a bottle. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but the only reason that liquor stores were kept open during COVID was because all the detox units at all the local hospitals all the detox units were now turned into COVID wards. So the only two things you can die from are alcohol withdrawal and benzos withdrawal, like Adderall. So they kept the liquor stores open because they figured if people are going to drink, they might as well keep drinking, because I've seen way too many people over the years, unfortunately, die from alcohol withdrawal. So if you're not aware of that, you should be aware that you can die from alcohol withdrawal. So that was a big problem. And it took a long time because of the stigma. So now you have the stigma on top of COVID, and people feel lost. And I can tell you now, in 2025, I'm just beginning to work with people who are coming out of the COVID era. They were hurt. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know who to ask for help. But now they are doing it. And I think that slowly, the stigma is going away. But it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of work for people like you that are watching the show. They're watching this webinar today. I think that many people need to really speak up. And I would say parents, if you're watching this webinar and you may have maybe young kids, you need to be able to talk to your kids every day. Because I think when I was working in Binghamton High School, and it was funny back then. So this is back in like 2013 to 2016. It was crazy. Binghamton at that time had the largest percentage in the country, 15% of grandparents raising their grandkids, because the parents were out of the picture. They were in drug addiction, locked up in prison, whatever it was. And it was a big problem. And I was trying to get more parents involved in the kids, but they were too busy. So I think that parents these days have a responsibility to spend more time with their children. I've seen a change. As a young kid, I think it was a different story. Parents are more involved with schools, with PTA and stuff like that. But these days, a lot of households, both parents are working or one parent's working, and the kids don't get the help they need, the support that they need. So I think that you need to trace that back as early as possible and talk to kids every day. I would say even if you have older children, I think the issue is that people get so caught up in the everyday rush, they forget to take a time out and think about what's going on with their lives.
Let's jump in with a question. And so
Yes.
much great information has been shared already. And so if you have a question, you can email me at the address on the screen, or as I had shared before, send that in on the comment box on Facebook or on the microsite. And you mentioned COVID because that was just such a significant force socially, and just kept us isolated for what felt like a tremendously long amount of time, and a lot of after effects that many of us felt. And so sometimes there's like a flip side with things like that. And so I kind of wonder if that's what we're seeing here, where because there was so much isolation, it really exacerbated existing problems. So if you had some mental health issues and you're kind of on the edge to start with, COVID kind of sent you even further. And there were more people seeking out telehealth counseling or in-person counseling once that became available. Addictions that were, maybe if somebody was on the verge of an addiction, it turned into a full-blown addiction, or somebody relapsed. Would that even be like remotely helpful, something like COVID, in the sense of like, all right, because this brought these issues to the forefront, could this help reduce the stigma and say this almost, I don't say normalize it, because maybe that really can't happen, but these things are a lot more common now and get talked about a lot more after COVID than they were, say, in 2019.
Yeah, and Steve, the fact is, what's to say that something like that couldn't happen again? I hopefully it never does. I never thought I would see that in my lifetime, that's something that would happen. In fact, as an addiction counselor, what we were forced to do was, instead of doing one-on-one, face-to-face, counseling in our facility, we had to go to Zoom. So you can imagine me doing a Zoom session with 15 patients for 2 years. I almost had to deal with the Zoom fatigue. But I think that the flip side of that is that because of COVID, I would think that more people now would want to realize what happened, what could have happened, and what could happen again. And I think now, yes, you are seeing a lot of things on TV regarding telehealth. And I think telehealth is an amazing thing. Me personally, if I'm working with somebody, I want to kind of work with them on a one-on-one basis to see them face to face, because it's really hard sometimes to feel somebody's emotions through a screen. But I think, yeah, that's a great question. I think that, COVID, I don't think people realize to what extent it hurt people. I think, in fact, I had a couple of moms in my group at the time of COVID, and they had young children in elementary school in the Syosset area where I was working at the time. And so what they did was, because socialization is so big, I think a lot of kids that went through COVID are still beginning to figure out what happened. They lost that socialization piece. Kids need to socialize. So what these parents did was they homeschooled the kids. They brought together some tutors. They brought them into the home. About 5 or 6 families got together. They brought the kids together into one home, and they would rotate every day of the week. They would take the kids out to the park so they could socialize with each other, and it kept them normal. And what happened was, when kids started going back to school, these families decided not to send the kids back to school. They decided to keep them at home, to keep them so they could have more socialization. Because even when kids went back to school, it wasn't the same. And I don't think it's the same now either. In fact, if you want to talk about the stigma of addiction, how bad it can be, when COVID hit, I'll never forget on my podcast, one of the first moms I had on was talking about, Amanda Faith was talking about her son, Luca. He was home because there was no school, so kids were going to school at home, right? He was on Snapchat. Snapchat was talking about, pills, and somehow, he got a hold of a pill through Snapchat. 13 years old. His parents came home and he was dead because the pill was laced with fentanyl. So on the flip side of that, because of people were isolated, it created a huge problem. And who's to say that's not going to happen again? That's why I think that now people need to be more aware to talk about their feelings, to talk about their emotions. I have found that most people I work with, when they come in, when they finally decide to get help, and you know what? Unfortunately, the time they come in and ask for help is when they've suffered a consequence. Multiple DWIs, or somebody died in the family, or that something happened for them and they had like a breakdown. Now they ask for help. I don't think you should ask for help then. I think you should ask for help when maybe things are okay. Like I've gone back when I said earlier, therapy is a really good thing. If you're listening to this webinar, I would encourage you to get a therapist if you don't have one. Most companies' insurance policies handle therapy. And now you've seen it, like Steve was talking about. You've got all these telehealth places all over. So if you don't feel comfortable going into a facility, you can do telehealth with somebody. But I would encourage you to please talk more about it as a family. Now, that was the other thing, Steve, that happened during COVID, was that it forced families to be together. So I think that was the good thing that came out of COVID, was that families spent more family time together. Like I always ask my patients, when was the last time your family sat down to have dinner together? I remember when I was a young kid, we all had dinner together at the same time. And I know kids that grew up in their families, like if you didn't sit down for dinner at 6 o'clock, you didn't get served dinner. So families came closer together and they spent a good time together. But then things changed and families broke apart again. I think that, families need to spend more time together. I tell parents that I work with that have young kids or even teenagers that they should pick a day of the week and sit down and have family time. How's school going today? I know that when I was growing up, we didn't talk about stuff with our parents. I think it was just a generational thing. We didn't talk about that stuff. We talked about it in the schoolyard with our friends, but we should have been talking to our parents about it. I think parents have a responsibility now. The problem is that kids, they're afraid that if they go to talk to their parents about something, then maybe they're going to get punished. Maybe they're going to get judged. It shouldn't be like that. That's the beautiful thing about recovery. 12-step programs like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, and there's hundreds of 12-step programs now. People go because they know that they won't be judged. Nobody's going to shame them. They're going to talk about their feelings and their emotions. When I first got sober in 2008, I was broken. I mean, literally, my whole life crashed and burned. Everything around me was just, I lost everything. A wife and a son, and it was just, it was a pretty bad situation. But I went to Alcoholics Anonymous, and I walked into a room of people from all walks and ages, and I was able to sit there for weeks and cry about my problems, and people hugged me and said it's going to be okay. I ask guys that come into addiction recovery, when was the last time you cried? I think crying is a good thing. But I think the big problem, again, is that people don't want to show their emotions. They don't want to show their emotions because they think it's a sign of weakness if you cry or if you get upset or you're depressed or you have anxiety. This goes back to the whole thing about the stigma. Until people start to open up and ask for help, and on top of that, tell people that it's okay. If you're seeing a therapist and you have a friend that is maybe struggling and they're a close friend of yours and they talk about stuff, you should say to them, listen, you know what? You can talk to me, but I'm not a professional. Why don't you talk to a therapist who can help you? Because so many people go through life. When people come into therapy and I work with them, I have two goals for them: to become the best version of themselves and to become the person they were always meant to be. So many people go through a lifetime never getting there, never becoming the best version of themselves, never becoming the person they were always meant to be. Because what happened was they were kids like us. We had dreams, aspirations, things they wanted to do. And then life got in the way and they got lost in the shuffle and they just kind of gave up. They decided, like I said earlier, so many people live their life based on other people's expectations for them. I had a roommate when I was in college, and he was pre-med. He never wanted to be a doctor, but his father was a doctor, his uncle was a doctor. So the goal was to be a doctor, and he hit bottom, and he in his junior year, he decided, I can't do this anymore, because the pressure of a pre-med student in Binghamton is intense, or any school is intense. So things like that happen all the time. I think we can stop things like that. Like I told you about the other kid. If your kid doesn't want to do something, encourage their dreams. Don't force them to do something that they don't want to do.
I mean, I'm curious from your side, and you've seen this from being an addict yourself, and then also in helping people to overcome addictions. Why has it been so slow for these attitudes in society to change? And I'm wondering if part of it is that it's not just the addiction, but it's the behaviors that sometimes get associated with it. So, for instance, we treat cancer like an illness, which it is. So
Right.
Somebody gets cancer, and we legitimately accept that as the person is sick. That's never questioned as like a moral failing of the person or an action that they did that caused it. Except maybe if it's lung cancer, you say they were a smoker, that makes some sense. But
Yeah.
even then, we tend to have much more compassion about it. We don't blame them.
Yeah.
But in a situation, somebody who's in addiction, they're stealing to try to get money to fuel the addiction. They're getting a DWI because they can't stop drinking, and then they go out and crash their car, or God forbid they hurt someone, something like that. So one illness has these negative consequences associated with it, while the other doesn't. Is that part of why that attitude change hasn't happened? We say we're going to blame the person. It's your fault. It's your moral failing.
Yeah.
It's you. It's not the illness.
And Steve, it's not. The deal is that if you see a guy walking through the streets, a homeless guy, and he's mumbling to himself, how do you know this guy's not a veteran that came back from Afghanistan and got kicked to the curb? I work with so many veterans that are homeless. That's one of my biggest things. I fight this all the time. This government, we spend millions of dollars to create killing machines. We send these guys and women over to fight these battles. They become drug addicted, just to get through what they do. I worked with an Army sniper who was addicted to cocaine. But they knew he was addicted to cocaine, but he was an Army sniper, and then he gets discharged and comes back home and gets kicked to the curb. I work with the VA. And so, somebody could be walking the streets, mumbling to themselves, and you just think, look at that. Look, oh my God, stay away from that person. Well, how do you know that 2 weeks ago, that person could have been the CEO of a company? What took me to my knees with addiction was, I was working for a big telecommunications company, had, a lot of money, blah, blah, blah. The company went chapter 11, chapter 7. I lost everything, and I was brought to my knees, but maybe because I was a middle-class guy, that people wouldn't be as awkward as to somebody who's like, Steve, you talk about drinking and driving. Here's the thing. If somebody knew they had an alcohol problem and it was okay to talk about it, then maybe they can get the help they need. But they don't think it's a problem. People around them think it's not a problem. So that, how many people are drinking and driving? Oh my God. If I could tell you how many DWIs I deal with on a monthly basis, and DWIs today are no joke. So I think to go back to what you were saying, Steve, it's true that because people associate what addiction looks like, they don't want to talk about it. It's about shame. It's about guilt. Look at that person. How could that happen to them? Well, you know what? There's such a fine line these days between somebody being fine, having everything that they want, and the next day losing it all. because they didn't want to talk to somebody about a problem they have. Whether it's so it's mental health. They're depressed. They don't want to talk to anybody about it. So what do? They smoke a lot of pot. Now I can tell you, I talked about it earlier, and I do a blog once in a while, and I wrote a whole thing recently about, the ill effects of marijuana, and it really does change the chemistry of the brain and stuff. So people think I'll do this to try to calm myself, but it's not really doing it. It's making it worse. So yes, I think that until people can recognize that if that person out there looks like he's struggling, it's what's going on inside the person. It's not the outside. It's not what's happening. The diagnosis, that doesn't carry the person. You have to be able to know what's going on with that person. And I've worked with, like I said, Steve, I've worked with so many veterans and first responders that their life collapses and now they've lost everything and they're walking the streets, right? And people think, oh, look at that person. Let me stay away from him. But that's wrong, Steve. We need to embrace that. We need to say, walk up to that person and say, can I help you? Is everything okay?
I mean, it sounds like, from what we're talking about here, what I'm hearing is that it's going to take some work to realize that the need for therapy is much more prevalent than we may tend to think it is. It's not 50 years ago where you got labeled as being crazy if you needed something like that. And you did almost anything possible if you were in a situation where you're getting therapy for people not to know that. Let's just pretend like we signed off of this webinar at 1:00 if you were here on campus, like we went walking on the Peace Quad or something like that. Or somewhere like New York City, go out in Times Square and you say, like, for X amount of people that are out in whatever public space we're in, say, like, there are these different segments. There are the people who are in the therapy now. There are the people who were in the therapy. And what's left? Probably the people who are going to be in therapy at some point in the future. So, it has that way of affecting all of us, whether or not people tend to realize that.
Well, Steve, I was saying, and hope you agree with this, I think that mental health is a huge problem. I think everybody probably has dealt with something in their life, something happened to them in their life, or maybe they're going on right now and they've got a lot of stress, they've got a lot of stress from work, stress at home, family situations, and they just don't want to deal with it. So what do? Steve, they drink. They drink to try to numb it. They drink to try to be like, I think if society had its choice, everybody be comfortably numb. Because if you look at all the ads on TV and you watch movies, alcohol is so prevalent. Watch some shows where is alcohol not prevalent? In fact, it's funny. I was talking to my patients the other day, and they're just getting sober, and they're coming up to Thanksgiving. And usually they have a big Thanksgiving gathering with their family. And a lot of people are big drinkers. And I said to the guy, "What would happen if you and your wife sent out a message to all your relatives saying, we can't wait for Thanksgiving this year, but it's going to be a dry Thanksgiving. There'll be no alcohol involved." He couldn't figure out how many people wouldn't come. You think about how many people can't go to an event without drinking. It's crazy if you think about it, because I think that most people out there, and I'm not judging, I'm just saying that most people that I've dealt with over the years self-medicate because they can't deal with life on life's terms, and they just try to find a way to make it through. And I did that, I talk about it in my book. I was comfortably numb for 20 years. I just kind of wanted to show the world that I was okay, that I dressed okay, went to work, had the right job, but I was torn and sick inside. I didn't know how to deal with it, so I drank. And so many people today are doing that. They're drinking, cocaine's a big drug. Again, I think a lot of people, they say they might be smoking pot recreationally, but I think at some point in time, it becomes more than that. It helps them kind of be comfortably numb. And Steve, that's no way to live. That's no way to live, to be comfortably numb and just kind of make it through. I think that we have to address that, Steve. We have to, people need to be, it should be okay to ask for help. We need to break that stigma. And I think the more people that are asking for help need to tell their friends, you know what, I've got this great therapist. You can't believe how much my life has changed because I'm able to talk about stuff that, Steve, if you trace it back to people in their 80s, 70s, 60s, they can trace stuff back to when they were kids. Something happened at home. It could have been.
I'm so glad you brought that up because, you had that a little bit earlier. We talked about trauma. And so I wanted to kind of dive into that concept a little bit more. And so some forms of trauma are very, very obvious, and they're horrible. And,
right.
And some are a little bit less easy to detect, but they still have these after effects that get felt for years and years that, can spiral into these addictions. And, it could be surprising to these people to figure out how and why that happened, because they may not make the connection between that thing that happened, in their childhood or early adulthood. And so I didn't expect to talk about this today, but
Oh yeah,
a lot of people would look at me in this shape and say, I could picture he had always looked like this. And trust me, I hadn't, and, for years and years, it wasn't drugs, it wasn't alcohol, it wasn't anything like that. It was food that was the where the addiction manifested. And I had only recently figured out how and why that started up. And I was astounded, because it was not by something overtly horrible happening in my life do you think, well, that would spiral into addiction, because my God, who could survive that, right? It wasn't anything like that. And so, from your side, what are the less obvious forms of trauma that that you've seen in your practice, to where it's not as simple? It's not like somebody had an abusive childhood, and so they're gonna drink to try to forget it, or something at that level.
Well, I just actually did an intake yesterday on a lady. I think she's maybe 51, and her drug problem really kind of got out of control over the last couple of years. And as we started doing the work and started talking to her, what came down to it was she was 10 years old. She babysat across the street for her friends of her parents, and she was molested by that father for 2 or 3 years, and she never told anybody about it. She was ashamed to tell her parents about it, and she carried that with her for years until she broke away, and it stayed with her for now. You're talking about 30 plus years. And when she finally told her father about it when she was in her 30s, the father he shrugged it off. So I can tell you that I've been doing this for a long time. Sexual abuse and molestation comes in so many ways, shapes, and forms, and people never talk about it because they think I can't tell you how many adults I've talked to that were molested or had sexual abuse by an aunt or an uncle or whatever it is. And they kind of just, okay, it happened when I was 12 or 10 or 9, and now I'm in my 40s, and I never really thought about it. But the fact is, like I said, trauma never goes away. It just kind of sits there and it builds up like a volcano. And then when you least expect it, it blows up. So things that you would never think are issues become a big issue. And trauma, yeah, there's things that we visualize. But think about this, Steve. 9/11, I know so many people that didn't live in the city that were affected by 9/11, that were just afraid they were going to look out their house the next day and they were going to see a plane, crashing into something. So I've got a guy now who, since 9/11, has never taken the train back into the city because he's afraid to go into the tunnel, and it's taken a lot of work. I think there's more people struggling with PTSD than we're aware of. That's why I'm saying that now. If something happened to you when you were a kid, bullying, maybe you were bullied as a kid. I work with a lot of adults now that were bullied. I had a guy I dealt with last week. This is crazy. He worked for the phone company, and his drinking got so bad, he was falling off the pole, and they said, you got to get help. And he was 55, and we started doing the work, and we started talking about trauma. And one night he started crying. I like when people cry because it means we're opening up a wound. Turns out that he was molested as an altar boy when he was 12 years old and never told anybody about it. Because think about the shame going to your parents and telling them that your priest is molesting you as an altar boy. He carried that around, Steve, for 30, 40 years, and it tore him up inside. So the only way that he could deal with that was by drinking. So I think that more than we know, people have struggled with some kind of a little trauma that happened, or it could be a big trauma. Listen, Sandy Hook, Katrina, a lot of these things that people watched on TV. It's like vicarious trauma. You see it happening out there, and you're afraid it's going to happen to you. I talk about it all the time with my patients about that. I tell all my patients that I work with, do me a favor, don't watch the news. Don't watch the news. Because if you get up in the morning, you're at 6 o'clock in the morning, you put on the news and you see a horrible story, you're going to be thinking that, oh my God, is that going to happen sometime today? And there's nothing good coming out of the news, Steve. It's it's all about people living in the chaos, So I think that somebody can watch a story and it triggers something that happened to them earlier. So let's say you were watching the news and you heard about a horrible thing that happened to some kid, and you're thinking, oh man, that happened to me when I was 13 years old. I've never talked about it, but that's all of a sudden triggering something. Now, if that triggers something that happened 20, 30 years ago, and you don't know how to deal with it, how are you going to deal with it? You're going to drink. You're going to drink. You're going to do something to self-medicate because you don't want to deal with it. It's like, it's a bad thing. I can't talk about it. There's shame and guilt that goes with it. People don't want to hear about it. You know, Steve, it's a bad thing.
It made me think of survivor's guilt, which is something I personally had felt during COVID. Having a longtime friend, and it was a relationship that was like a little bit troubled, and we had like a falling out, and kind of sort of, got back together in a way, and then, he died of COVID 3 days before Christmas in 2021, and here subsequently I had COVID twice, and it barely did a thing to me, and you just struggle to think about the unfairness of that on the surface, and then you realize that it's just one of these things that life just can't answer for you, and you just say that was him and it was unfortunate, and this is me, and I can only be thankful to be alive. It didn't spiral into an addiction for me, but it was still it was a very difficult thing to get over, and once in a while I remember him, and I feel horrible about what had happened, but I realized that I don't control the universe, and but and just to to grieve it for what it is, and just say, well, I'm here and I can be here with my family, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, in fact, I experienced that myself, Steve. When I was when COVID hit, I was driving into our treatment facility every day, and there was no cars on the road. It was like Twilight Zone. It was like barren, and they were talking about you have to, if your breathing gets bad, And I remember driving to the treatment facility, and like is my breathing is okay? Am I going to be okay? Like, like all these people are dying. I've had clients who are like nurses and doctors in hospitals, and how many of them talk about trauma? A nurse that I work with, she saw people dying every day. But here's the flip side of that. I was dealing with an 81-year-old woman. During COVID, she broke her shoulder and she was in the hospital. While she was in the hospital, 5 of her closest friends died from COVID. So she was like traumatized, she was like, oh my God, talk about survivor guilt and all this stuff. But I started working with her. She was 81 years old, and I started working with her. And I love working with elderly clients. And it turned out that that COVID had uncovered so much more stuff that happened in her childhood, with the parents and the abuse. Abuse comes in many shapes and forms, Steve. It can be sexual abuse, it can be physical abuse, it can be emotional abuse. Now, physical abuse, if somebody breaks an arm or hurts somebody, those scars go away. But the emotional abuse, the scars inside, they never go away. And the only way those scars inside can be healed is by talking. That's what I'm saying. Talk therapy is the best thing. There's no pill on this planet, Steve, that's going to cure anxiety or depression or bipolar. I mean, well, I wouldn't say bipolar. Some people actually need medication, but in cases like depression and anxiety, there's no pill that's going to save that, Steve. You need to talk about it. So my whole thing about this talk today is that the stigma, if more people, Steve, ask for help, I mean, I would think that it would be a much better world, that people would know it's okay. But Steve, that most people don't want to talk about their issues and their problems because they think that they're going to be like, what's wrong with you? Be a man, suck it up.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's hard for men to make friends because they feel they just have to be on top of it. It's like they can't be vulnerable, and are often surprised to find out, hey, here's another guy that's going through the exact same thing as me. And but many times those conversations don't happen. And you had mentioned a couple minutes ago about the holidays, so I thought as we get near, like about 7 minutes left in the program, give or take, and we can go a little bit over because some of the stuff is really good.
Holidays
brings families together. As you mentioned, that like it really sticks out if somebody says, hey, we're gonna have a dry Thanksgiving, we're gonna have a dry Christmas, dry Hanukkah, and be like, whoa, like even if you're not like a heavy drinker, just that kind of goes against the grain. Be like, I'm not expecting that because it's just the given that's always part of the celebrations. But what are some things that people could do as far as trying to deal with that holiday stress as much as possible, or is maybe this is the time of year. It's like give the gift to yourself of healing of like, instead of just like, we've got the family gatherings and like all the stressors now are like kind of in the same room. And for many times, like, for every family that enjoys like being together, you have some where you put them together and it's maybe not what you want to do.
Oh, no, it can be trauma. Yeah, it can be trauma.
So how can we get through that? Because, it can be very tough. And it's like all that stuff that like, you spend like 10 months out of the year trying to just put aside. Now all of a sudden of November, December, you can't ignore it any longer.
Well, they talk about it in recovery. That's the trifecta: Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. That are the 3 hardest times in a year for a person in recovery to be able to deal with the holidays, because the holidays can be very triggering. But what I've had some of my clients do, and they've actually done it on their own, they've created new ways of dealing with the holiday. Here's the thing. I think holidays, in extent, it's all about marketing, right? Here's the thing. If a husband wants to show his wife he loves her, he can give her a flower or a rose. It doesn't have to wait until Valentine's Day. If a family wants to get together and have dinner, they can do that. It doesn't have to be during Thanksgiving. I think that people look forward to the holidays because it's a time to really, let go, right? To drink. And I think that maybe it means like, taking that time of the year to create, I don't know, something new. I've had families now talking about, what they said to their friends, we're going to have holidays going to be different this year. We're going to get together. We're going to do some board games. We're going to try to enjoy each other's company. When it comes to Thanksgiving, we're going to have each person at the table, write a gratitude list, things that they're grateful for, to talk about things that really are important to them. Instead of I find that when Thanksgiving or holidays, when most people get together, all of a sudden the drinking takes off and people are just kind of off on their own and kind of lose contact with each other. And if families are having hard times, that's a difficult time for somebody. Now I would tell somebody, if somebody listening to this webinar is like, maybe you think you might have an alcohol problem, you're not sure, and the holidays are coming up and it's a lot of stress, I would say, programs like AA, they have alcothons all day long on Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. You can just go and sit in a room with people and just listen to what people have to say. Be around people that are sober. I think that people are scared. Steve, this is the thing I hadn't talked about. I think people are scared by sober people. I think people, they get scared by it because it's like, oh my God, like you're sober? You mean you're okay? You mean you don't have to drink? What's wrong with you? It's like I went to a restaurant to have dinner with some friends and the waitress came around and asked for the drink orders. And I was like, no, I'm good. And it was almost like pressure. Come on, man. Come on. You can have one drink. It's like, as a society, people can't accept the fact that it's okay not to drink. And I can tell you, though, I think the trend is changing now because I'm working with a lot of young adults, and young adults aren't drinking as much as they used to. I think that's really changing now. They're all more health conscious now, which is a good thing. But the physical piece is great, being health conscious, nutrition, and eating better. But to answer your question, I think people need to come up with new traditions that don't involve alcohol. I mean, it's crazy, right? But I can tell you that as a person, 17 years sober, there are still times when I was invited to a friend's wedding. Well, actually, my son had a friend that was getting married, and I was invited to a wedding because my son had all these friends that were very close together. And I was invited to the wedding, and I made it through the cocktail reception. And then I sat down at a table with some people that I really didn't know. And they had been drinking and they started spilling drinks. And I just said, you know what? What am I doing here? And I just got up and I left, because my sobriety is more important to me. I'm not going to sit someplace and white knuckle it just to get through it. And that's a big thing for me today, like even 17 years later. The one thing I've learned about sobriety, and I think this is what people should always build to, is that you should never have to be in an uncomfortable situation. If something is triggering you, get out. But it always goes back to the fact that we need to talk about it more, Steve. We need to talk about it more.
Got a excuse me. Got a viewer question that just came in. How do you encourage someone who is suffering from addiction to get help without shaming or forcing? So, as we get into the last couple of minutes of the webinar, I think this is a great question because, I wanted to sort of distill this down to some next immediate steps for somebody that is either suffering from addiction and looking for help and wants to do it in a way where they don't feel a sense of shame about it because they really shouldn't, or for somebody who's a caregiver and has somebody very close to them and is desperately wanting to help them.
Well, I've done a lot of family interventions over the years. I think that if somebody knows somebody who's really struggling, I would say do a little bit of homework. Call up the local treatment center and find out where there are available facilities for help, and then in a nice way, go to this person and say, listen, you know what? You're a dear friend of mine, or you're a family member. I really care about you. It's clear to me that you're struggling, and that's okay. But I think I found some places where you might be able to go and get the help that you need. And I'll actually go with you. I'll go to the appointment with you. I think it's about people becoming more educated, Steve, about alcohol and drug addiction, knowing what it's all about. Like if you had a family member that had cancer, you'd want to learn all about cancer, right? If you had a family friend that was dealing with a disease, you'd want to learn about it, like diabetes or whatever, to help them. Why shouldn't it be the same thing about addiction? People need to learn more about it. There's so many community resources now available. So I would say find out about those resources that are available, and then go to the person who's struggling and say, I need help. Now, I'll tell you right now, if anybody out there knows somebody who's struggling, or you're struggling and you are afraid to reach out, contact me. I think, Steve, here's my email address, okay? And you can call me, you can text me, you can call me anytime. And I work with parents and people all across the country. Talk to me and I can help you find the place to get help, because I think that it's just about ripping off the Band-Aid and asking for help. And I think that's the reason. If you know somebody who's struggling and you don't know how to go about it, reach out to me. You can get me on my email address. I'm on Facebook, Instagram. Just reach out to me, call me, text me, and I'd be more than happy to reach out to you and help you, because sometimes it just means somebody who cares. You can help somebody and not feel like it's shame or guilt. Reaching out to somebody saying, you know what? You're a good friend of mine, or you're my cousin or my whatever, and I care about you and I really want to help. And I think I can help you because I've done some homework and I found a couple of places, and I'm going to go with you. I'm going to go with you and help you get the help that you need. I think that's so important. If we can do that more on a regular basis, Steve, that will help break the stigma. That will let people know it's okay to not be okay. If I can end it with that, yeah, it's okay not to be okay. Just ask for help. And I'll be more than happy to help you in any way that I can, no matter where you are in the country. I've helped people out in California, down in Florida, out in Texas. They've called me up and say, Merrit, I got a family member who's struggling. How can I help them? And I've got contacts all across the country, so I can tell them, you're in San Antonio, I'll tell you where to go. And if you're struggling as a person and you're afraid of how to deal with that, call me. I'll help you get through it.
I'm going to leave the contact information up on the screen for the next couple of minutes as we kind of transition into wrapping up for today. And so I definitely encourage people to either reach out for help in your immediate area or reach out to Merrit. And Merrit is very passionate about not only helping people in general, but also helping people in the Binghamton universe because he loves Binghamton a lot. So take him up on it, and I guarantee it will be worth the effort to do so. And yeah, it's just.
I hope it was good, Steve. I hope it was informative.
Yeah, I think this was very. I think this was a very important topic to tackle. It's very tough to talk about these things, which is why it doesn't happen. But I was just thinking just now while we're addressing the viewer question about how do you help someone without shaming or forcing them, and sometimes it can be all in who makes the ask. Exactly. Where maybe coming from a certain person. The ask is not very well received because they feel like somebody's just kind of pressuring them. They feel like it's nagging them. Maybe it takes the right person just because of their connection they have with someone and the way that they make it seem non-threatening. And it just takes that one right person to ask, and it can really just make all the difference. And
you could save a life.
I wish people well, because it really is tough times, and there's just so much going on, and thankfully we're out of a pandemic, and hopefully we don't go back into one, but going into the holidays, which are really, really tough for people. And so I'm glad we offered this here as we're getting into late October, and really at any time of year it's like ask for help, and it's like a lot of things. You'll find you're not the only one, and people go through these things in various to various degrees. We just never say it. Nobody wears a badge out in society that says, recovering alcoholic, or I'm a recovering food addict, or whatever else, or I feel depressed today. Yeah. You'd be astounded how many do that.
You could save a life by helping somebody. You could actually save a life.
So Merrit, thanks so much for joining us. And so, yes, once again, I encourage people to contact you if they need it, but
please
appreciate it. It's like, this was a fast hour, and I want to say it was fun. It was great to chat with you, although this was a heavy topic. So,
yeah, it is. It is a heavy topic.
I need to go out for a walk after or something, just kind of like recharge, and just because it's. But if we saved one person, I always say at the end of these things, no matter what the topic is, and many times it's much lighter. I say if we made things better, if we helped one person. That's it. And I hope it's more. But if we helped one, it was worth it for me to roll out of bed and get down here to campus today, because I feel like we did something. So
absolutely.
Merrit, thank you so very much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
And thanks to all of you, and definitely take Merrit up on the on contacting him. And I'll just put this up for just a couple seconds as we look to transition out of today's webinar. We'll be back in early November looking at AI and legal and project management. We'll have a session in December on resumes, and then we'll have a webinar in January, toward the end of January, on women and wealth. So a great topic to start the year in 2026. And we're just planning to have webinars all through the first couple of months in that first half of the calendar year 2026. So lots of great programs. We usually take December off because of the holidays and not a lot of people watching, but we had so many speakers that wanted to be part of this program that we decided to offer a December webinar. And so if you want to be a speaker, just like Merrit was today, and you have a topic that you want to pitch, everything's considered. So go ahead and send me an email. Let me know what it is that you want to talk about and the expertise level that you have. We'll schedule a conversation, and perhaps there could be a fit. We could get you on the calendar, and you could be the expert for the day, just like Merrit was, and share your knowledge with the Binghamton Alumni Network, and I know they certainly appreciate it. So we'll wrap up for today here on the Binghamton Learning Network, and so I hope everybody has a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week. So for Merrit Hartblay, I'm Steve C. Prasad. Thank you so much. We'll see you next month on the next webinar.